And Venerable Khadro will be back next Thursday at this same time to continue with the Middle Link, Lamrim. So this morning we'll do some review. I didn't have a lot of time to prepare, so we'll see what comes up. And let's begin with some prayers, and then we'll do some silent meditation, and then we'll strengthen our bodhicitta motivation.
To the teacher endowed, transcendent destroyer, one thus gone, foe destroyer, completely and fully awakened one, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, one gone to bliss, know of the world, supreme guide of beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and humans, to you, the Buddha endowed, transcendent destroyer, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. When, O supreme among humans, you were born on this earth, you paced 7 strides and said, I am supreme in this world. To you who are wise, then I bow. With pure body, swarm supremely fine, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain, fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best, supreme guide, to you I bow. With the supreme science, face like the spotless moon, color like gold, to you I bow. You are immaculate, the 3 worlds are not incomparable, wise one, to you I bow. Great compassionate protector, all-knowing teacher, field of merit and good qualities, vast as an ocean, to the Tathagata I bow. Through purity, freeing from attachment, through virtue, freeing from the lower realms. Unique, supreme, ultimate reality, to the Dharma that is peace I bow. Having freed themselves, showing the path to freedom, too well established in the trainings. The holy field endowed with good qualities, to the Sangha I bow. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind completely, this is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, mirage, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew, a bubble. A dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see conditioned things as such. Through this merit may sentient beings attain the state of all-seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from the ocean of cyclic existence, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. This ground anointed with perfume, flowers strewn, Mount Meru, 4 lands, sun and moon, imagined as a Buddha land and offered to you, may all beings enjoy this pure land. Venerable holy gurus, in the space of your truth body, from billowing clouds of your wisdom and love, let fall the rain of the profound and extensive Dharma, in whatever form is suitable for subduing sentient beings. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings.
So let's just take a few minutes to settle into the space and just check to see that your meditation posture is conducive for doing some breathing meditation, focusing in the mind, bringing yourself fully present to what's happening here. And just focusing on the breath to allow the mind to settle. Now let's just take a moment to augment our bodhicitta motivation that we cultivated earlier this morning. Recently, Venerable Tenzin gave us a beautiful analogy, or what would you call it? She was describing how at night she looks up into the stars when the stars are visible, and she just imagines how many countless sentient beings live on different planets and different universes, filling all of space. There are sentient beings. And that's been such a good reminder to open up the mind, widen the mind, especially when something of small concern is occupying too much of our attention. We can really think about, widen our mind to take in the wishes of all sentient beings, wishing for happiness, wishing to be free of suffering. So thinking about how all of space is filled with sentient beings, and those sentient beings have afflictions, except for arhats, all sentient beings have afflictions. And when there are afflictions, we know that negative actions follow. And negative actions is what leads to suffering. So take a moment now to think about all these sentient beings who have been so kind in countless ways. We can imagine that all of them have been our father, our mother, our sister, brother, friend, child, all wanting happiness, wanting to be free of suffering. So for a moment, just cultivate the mind. How wonderful it would be if they met with peace and happiness. How wonderful if all of them met with peace and happiness, the causes of happiness. How wonderful if every single one of them were free of suffering and all the causes of suffering. And to whatever degree you're ready, generate that altruistic intention, that wholehearted resolve. I would like to bring that about. I will bring that about for all sentient beings. I will take responsibility to bring about the happiness and the freedom of suffering of every living being, starting with myself and extending that out to all others. And the only way to do that is to accomplish the full state of enlightenment of a Buddha. And so generate that aspiration now. Last week, Venerable Khadro was highlighting how the Lamrim that we're studying, the Lamrim, the middle link Lamrim, is a review manual for those who have already studied some of the great classics. So that could be a little daunting for us because I think most of us haven't studied the great classics in a lot of detail. Classics like the Ornament for the Clear Realization, Ornament of Clear Realization, or Ornament of the Mahayana Sutras, or the different commentaries on the treaties, Nagarjuna's treatise on the Middle Way, things like that, the Abhidharma. So she mentioned that the monks and nuns in the Tibetan monasteries have studied the afflictions in great detail. They're outlined in great detail in many of those texts. And that may be why the afflictions in this middle scope of the Lamrim is really quite brief when you look at it. There's not a lot of information there. But it's interesting because these are the main causes of all our suffering. So probably for the rest of us, for me anyway, I find it very helpful. Although I've studied them many times, probably many of you have too. I've gone over them. But I still find them popping up in my mind, so that shows me that I need to keep going over them again and again, learning to identify them more quickly, learning to apply the antidotes more quickly, really trying to analyze and investigate, know how they operate in my mind so that I get the upper hand on them rather than them having the upper hand on me. You find that's true for you as well? It's a long practice. I was thinking back that we have had a chance to study some of these afflictions. I was surprised to find out that we spent 6 months back in 2021 and 22 studying anger and patience, the antidotes to anger in the Engaging Bodhisattva's Deeds. And I was surprised it was so long ago. That seems like just a few months ago. But we spent 6 months going through that. And still, when we got to the end of it, several of us said, can we start over? Can we do that again? And maybe you noticed while we were going through that your anger was somewhat subdued. Did you notice that? No? Well, it can go either way, because when we do study things, then we start noticing them more often when they're there. And that's a good thing, right? You can only clean the dirt when you find the dirt's there. So that can be a good thing. But also, I think it's fair to say, I think all of us could say that if we check back to the time before we started studying Buddhism, we would find that, yes, there's been a definite change in our awareness of the afflictions like anger and other, yeah, we're more aware. Probably we have some antidotes that are ready to apply in each moment. So that's a good thing. I noticed when getting ready for the retreat last spring, getting honest with attachment, that I was able to catch more quickly when attachment was arising. And that one's sneakier than anger, isn't it? So that was a good thing. And then that class finished, and guess what? Attachment is difficult, I find. When you really look into the worldly concerns in particular, my gosh, they pretty much are there throughout the day. So, and that's just two afflictions. So the others are just as sneaky and pop up. And when I was listening to Venerable Khadro's teaching last week, she mentioned that Venerable Chodron had covered the root afflictions thoroughly in volume 3, as if, well, we've got that done. But that was in the spring also of 2021. That was a long time. I mean, 3 years ago, 3 or more years ago. So it's been a while. And we did spend, I think, 6 weeks covering the afflictions then. But still, they're there. They're deeply embedded. They're deeply habituated for most of us to one degree or another. And so we go over them again and again. So this morning, let's do some review about the Lamrim in general, and then maybe we'll get to 1 or 2 afflictions in more detail. I'm curious, is there anyone here who is new to studying a Lamrim text from beginning to end like we're doing with this middle-length Lamrim? Has everyone? Okay, a few people. One of the great contributions of Tibetan Buddhists to the study of Buddhism, I think, is not only this genre of teaching called the Lamrim. That in itself is pretty amazing. We've taken all the Buddhist teachings and put them in a very systematic way of study, thanks to Lama Tisha and others who came after him who elaborated on that mnemonic of, initial scope, middle scope, great scope. But in addition to that, one of the great contributions of Tibetan Buddhists is outlines. And so those of you who've heard my reviews before know that I have a great love and affection for outlines because they are so helpful in hanging on to the material. And so there are very detailed outlines. I was surprised that there's not an outline in the back of this middle-length Lamrim. But as we go through it, you can see that there are very clear outlines, and Venerable Khadro has been putting them up on the white or the screen. So we could be creating our own outline. Has anybody done that? Anybody? It'd be nice if someone did that. If anyone feels inspired, then you could share it with the rest of us. I still have the outline that we used from the Lamrim Chimmo. I think it's like 22 pages. It's very detailed. That might be a little bit daunting for us to hang on to, but we can at least hang on to the main points. And as we do that, we're building up our knowledge base so that we can, anytime we hear a teaching, anytime we read something of the Dharma, then we know where it fits in this outline. And so that can shore up the things that we've already studied or the things that should be studied before that. And it also reminds us of how that's setting a foundation for what comes after it. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it gives us a roadmap. Most of the new cars now have little screens and you can bring up the GPS. It's really helpful to see where you are on the road, and you can scroll ahead and see where you're going. You can look back and see where you've been. So these outlines are like the GPS of our Dharma study. Really helpful. So if we think about it, the preliminaries to this Lamrim outline of initial scope, middle scope, great scope, there are 2 topics that we covered. There are a lot of topics, but there are 2 main topics that we're encouraged to meditate on before we even get into the initial scope. Do you remember what those are? How to rely on a spiritual mentor and precious human life, right? So those are not actually part of the initial scope, but they're there as a foundation. And, as various teachers have said, it's kind of surprising to find how to rely on a teacher right up front, especially when most Westerners approach the Lamrim as like an introduction to Buddhism in a way. But it can be so helpful to learn about that topic right up front, because then we know what kind of teacher we're looking for, what kind of qualities to look for, and how we as a student need to rely on that teacher, and what kind of qualities we should be cultivating. So that can be very helpful. And then the preciousness of this human life really helps us to frame why we're even involved in this study to begin with. And then what about the initial scope? Generally, there are, well, 3 or 4 topics. I'm used to thinking of them in terms of 4. What's the first topic in the initial scope? Do you remember? Death and impermanence. Yeah, so helpful to think about that. Why? Because it gets us to pull our attention out of just focusing on this one life alone and start thinking about future lives. Okay, and then what follows from death and impermanence? Lower realms, looking at the suffering of the lower realms so that we're inspired, invigorated, encouraged to look beyond just this one life and to see, okay, I think most religions say that there's something that happens after death, whether they explain that as a heaven and hell or next lives or whatever the case may be. So then we start looking at, well, what are our options? How did the Buddha describe this? And there are fortunate rebirths and there are unfortunate rebirths. So that's where we really focus in on unfortunate rebirths. That's kind of hard to meditate on, do you find? You know, we've been encouraged many times to really put ourselves in the place of beings who have taken a lower realm rebirth. Animals is the easiest one to look at, but also to imagine these different realms that were described, hell realm beings and hungry ghosts, and really try to imagine what would that be like as an inspiration, as an encouragement to, you know, create the causes not to take one of those rebirths. Okay, so then several of you mentioned refuge as a topic that comes next. In the traditional Lamrims, it is refuge that comes next. I noticed that in the Library of Wisdom and Compassion, Venerable puts karma next. Why? Because for Westerners, that seems to that's the logical next step, that we're interested in looking at causes and conditions for lower realm rebirths, you know, if we can begin to identify those things. And then also refuge. So that's the initial scope in a nutshell. And then if you can, think about what are some of the main subpoints underneath each one of those 4 main points. If 4 is all you can hang on to, that's okay, great. Hang on to that. And if you can go further and just think about, how do I think about that topic of death and impermanence? How do I think about lower realm rebirths? What are they? How do I think about refuge and karma? And we spent a lot of time looking at karma. That's quite a detailed topic, but such an important one. So we've done all that with Venerable Khadro in this middle scope Lamrim. And so now we've arrived at the middle scope. And so what's the first topic there? Disadvantages of cyclic existence, and particularly the suffering, and lots of sufferings, right? Yeah, I think in general we could say looking at the 4 Noble Truths, you know, and we're specifically honing in on true suffering, which is looking at the disadvantages of cyclic existence. That's what brings it home. So we've spent a number of weeks looking at those sufferings. And again, when I look at my own practice, I'm a little bit lazy in going back and really delving into those sufferings. Although I can say that there have been different retreats where I have focused on those at different times. For instance, this Lamrim goes into we went over the sufferings of birth. There's 5 of those sufferings of birth. One retreat, I just took those 5 and I just kept going over them again and again and again, thinking and applying it to myself. It's very, very powerful to think about, you know, birth is suffering because of the dysfunctional tendencies, the fact that we come in with a backpack full of karma. We didn't come in with a clean slate. That's sobering when you think about it. Or when you think about suffering, birth is suffering because it's the origin of suffering. As soon as we're born, as soon as there's conception, actually, well, conception and then birth, you know, what we think of as birth, then there's aging in the next moment. There's illness, there's bound to be illness, there's bound to be death and everything else that comes with that. And also, have you taken time to really think about the 3 types of suffering? You know, we may have done this when we went through, we've had a couple of retreats, winter retreats on the 4 establishments of mindfulness. So anyone who has looked at mindfulness of feeling, boy, it can really pull the rug underneath us, can it? Because you find out that every feeling is suffering. You know, suffering, that's manifest suffering is obvious. But even pleasurable feelings, that's confronting, isn't it? And then really trying to understand what is this pervasive suffering of conditionality. Really, it's talking about our aggregates, the fact that we have aggregates controlled by karma and afflictions. So to spend time with that, and we have a winter retreat coming up, starting the end of next month. So it can be a time, even though we're going to be focusing on Chenrezig, it can be a time where we really give ourselves the opportunity to look into suffering in a lot more detail. Why? So that we develop that. It's renunciation. It's one of the main causes of renunciation. And then true origins. We've arrived at true origins, looking at the afflictions. And again, we probably have a good working knowledge of what the afflictions are. We know what they are. I know what they are intellectually, and yet they still arise and get the best of me at times. So that shows that it requires a lot more familiarity. And I was thinking about something that has come up in the news. You know, we have 2, I'm going to be careful here, but we have 2 presidential candidates, and they have very different styles. Have you noticed? Very different styles. On one hand, we have a candidate who is very scripted and sticks to her script. In fact, she's been criticized for sticking to her script. She pretty much says basically the same thing in every stump speech. And then we have another candidate who can wax and wane on various topics for an hour and a half, typically, in each stump speech given. And so there's 2 different styles there. And I read recently that the one who stays very scripted, when she was confronted with that, when someone asked her about why she's doing that, why she's not more extemporaneous and spontaneous, she said, well, I like to consider it as being disciplined. And I thought, well, now that's an interesting way to think about it. And I thought, you know, as I was preparing for today, I thought, what if I was that disciplined all throughout the day in my goals, you know, of renunciation? And I was really scripted about what comes out of my mouth and how I allow myself to think and what I allow myself to do. I thought, you know, there's something to that. You know, in our tradition, we are aiming to discipline our mind. So I just thought that might be an interesting analogy. Not promoting any candidate one way or the other, just using it as an example. Okay, so what else are we going to find in the middle scope? We've already covered some of these things when we were looking at the 3rd volume, Samsara, Nirvana, Buddha Nature. So that volume really covered heavily true origin and true suffering and true origin. Do you remember what else we covered there in quite detail? 12 links. Yeah, also another avenue for seeing the disadvantages of cyclic existence and for coming to understand how bound we are, bound in cyclic existence, how we are controlled by karma and afflictions. So helpful to, and also to see. Geshe Topke was talking about this recently. He was going through the forward order and the reverse order of, what was it, true suffering? I can't remember. Yeah, we went through 4 sets. Can you remember? It's been a while. Purified and non-purified, 12 links, something like that. So we went through that pretty extensively. So that's a good thing to go back and review, or else go back to volume 3 and really take a look at those 12 links. I appreciated how much detail His Holiness and Venerable Chodron provided in that description. It was different, again, than the usual kind of general overview that we usually get about the 12 links. So there's the 4 Noble Truths, especially the first 2, and then there's the 12 links. And then what else do we find in the middle scope? 3 higher trainings, right. So we're about to get into that in volume 4 with Venerable Chodron and also with Venerable Khadro, so we can see how both approaches really help us as Dharma practitioners, and especially as Western Dharma practitioners. And just to be fair, we haven't covered the Great Scope yet, but what you have, if you scroll through your Dharma GPS and look ahead, what you'll find is the Great Scope starts with developing the aspiration of bodhicitta. So the 2 methods for developing bodhicitta, and then the 6 perfections, and especially there's a strong emphasis on developing concentration and wisdom or insight. So we have that to look forward to. Although in volume 4, it's a little different, isn't it? We've started on the ethics section already, and we'll get into some concentration. Usually in the Lamrims, the classic Lamrims, there's a big emphasis on ethics, and then they skip over concentration and wisdom because you're going to get it with the 6 perfections. But His Holiness and Venerable put a different spin on that, and we're going to spend the last part of that book. When we develop wisdom, we're going to be looking at the 37 harmonies of enlightenment. So that can be another way to help us when we look at the 4 establishments of mindfulness, especially the mindfulness of feeling and the mindfulness of the mind, really looking into the mental factors, phenomena, mindfulness of phenomena, looking into all the different mental factors. So another way that we could summarize the small scope and the middle scope is in terms of what is the fear that a person is trying to overcome. Because the Dharma provides protection, right? The Buddha's Dharma provides protection from some fear. So what is the main fear of a lower scope practitioner? Lower rebirth, suffering rebirth, unpleasant rebirth, right. And so what's the object they're trying to attain? What's the goal? What are we aspiring to attain in the small scope? Fortunate rebirth, yeah. And Venerable added to that in her summary of the Lamrim, she added a peaceful death. Peaceful death and good rebirth, the 2 go together. So that's interesting to think about. So in the classic text, they talk a lot about high status and definite goodness. This is high status. We want a high status rebirth so that we can continue practicing the Dharma, going on to the more long-term goals that we have in mind. And then what is it that we need to abandon in the initial scope? In the tenets text, you find a lot about attainments and abandonments. So that's kind of where I had one teacher who really liked these kinds of summaries, when we go through something, then really pick out the main points so that you can hang on to it. I find that very helpful. So what's the main abandonment there in the initial scope? What are we trying to abandon or overcome? 10 non-virtues, right. And so what are the main antidotes that we find there in that scope? We can think about it in terms of method, the method side of the path, and we can think about it in terms of wisdom. So what's the method side of the path? Impermanence? Okay, impermanence, and also ethics. Yeah, let's just say ethics in general. But yeah, abandoning non-virtue and adopting virtue. Yeah. And then what about the wisdom side of the path? It's not wisdom realizing emptiness, but we do talk about a kind of wisdom that's found in the initial scope. Yeah, the wisdom that understands the law of cause and effect, or karma. Yeah. So that's like a nice, neat little framework that you can hang on to about what the initial scope practitioner, or what we as initial scope practitioners are trying to do. Okay, and so what's the fear the middle scope practitioner is trying to overcome? Samsara, suffering of cyclic existence. Yeah. The bondage. The Lamrim talks about this word bondage. That doesn't sound so good. All of us like freedom. We like, to feel like we can make choices and do what we want to do. But if we really reflect on our experience right now in samsara, we're controlled by karma and afflictions. And that's hard to admit, I think, when you really think about it, that's hard to admit. If someone had control over you, would you like it? None of us like that, right? To quit bossing me around. But we're bossed around every day by karma and afflictions, and we put up with it. It's kind of counterintuitive, but it's so habitual that we don't even see that that's what's happening. And we don't even, oftentimes we're not strongly aware, we're not disciplined enough to be aware throughout the day that we have a choice. There's another option that we can take on. So what about the objects of abandonment there of the middle scope practitioner? What are we aspiring to attain? Abandon ignorance. We're aspiring for renunciation, so that's the aspiration, isn't it? We're aspiring to develop that determination to be free of cyclic existence. That's right. And we're aiming to attain personal liberation. If that was their goal, that they would be attaining personal liberation. As Mahayanas, we're not so interested in personal liberation, but we do need the renunciation as part of bodhicitta. We have to cultivate it there, otherwise our bodhicitta will just be lip service. Yeah. And so what are we trying to abandon here in the middle scope? What's the object of abandonment? Afflictions, including ignorance. Yep, that's part of it. Those are afflictions. Yep. Karma and afflictions. Yep. So the afflictive obscurations, right? That's what the middle scope practitioner is trying to overcome, afflictive obscurations, which include karma and the seeds left behind. So when we talk about karma and afflictions, the karma, karma that word can be used in different ways, right? We are trying to overcome negative actions, but we're also trying to overcome or abandon the seeds on our mind stream, particularly the seeds that can give rise to a rebirth, especially, a contaminated rebirth of any kind at that point. So the afflictive obscurations, we can think about afflictions, including the different kinds of ignorance, as well as attachment, anger, all the rest, and the secondary afflictions as well. But when we think about karma, if we're trying to overcome these karmic seeds that are on our mind stream, that could propel a rebirth in samsara. So negative karma and contaminated karma. Negative karma that would lead to a lower rebirth, and contaminated karma, which includes virtue that's contaminated by ignorance, that could lead us, again, into samsara. So then what are the main paths or the main antidotes that we're going to use in the middle scope? We've already talked about some of them. What's the method side of the path? 3 higher trainings. Yep. 3 higher trainings includes the wisdom side too, though, doesn't it? So yes, we do need ethics and concentration, but even before that, we need that aspiration. So we're looking at true origins and true sufferings, which leads to renunciation. We need that renunciation to support the wisdom side, then, which is wisdom realizing emptiness. So that's where we have, the ultimate truth comes into play there. Okay. So when in my own experience, when we studied the Lamrim Chimo at Chenrezig Institute, I think it took a year and a half to go through very, very detailed study of that. And every day, Geshe Tashi Tsering would take us through some paces of going through the outline. And it was very helpful. Familiarization. Look at Geshe Tabke. Look how he repeats himself. It's important. Repetition is important. I remember one Black gospel singer saying, "You white people need to learn the power of repetition." And that's true. She said it twice. Yes, she said it twice. You white people need to learn the power of repetition. If you think about gospel singing, how they repeat lines, call and response and such. Okay. So here in the middle scope, our main activity is, at least for Mahayana practitioners, is developing renunciation, that mind intent on liberation. And so we meditated on the Four Noble Truths, especially the first two, the 12 links, and the 3 higher trainings. So first we need to develop a mind intent on liberation, to achieve liberation. We have to be intent on that. We have to have that disciplined stump speech in our mind about how I am aiming for full awakening, but along the way, first of all, I have to develop renunciation. I have to turn away from just being enamored and snared by the pleasures of cyclic existence. But before we can identify renunciation or that determination to be free, we first have to identify, well, what is liberation? What is it we're aiming for? And so we've talked about true cessations and the ultimate true cessations, where we're freeing our mind of the afflictions and the karmic seeds in a way that they will never return. So right now we're able to do some purification. We're rendering seeds on our mind stream incapable of giving rise to the result, but there's still seeds there. So we're not free. We're still influenced by those seeds. And in order to identify liberation, then we have to identify the opposite, cyclic existence. What is that? You know, it's always surprised me there's not a very clear, hard and fast definition of cyclic existence. But how would you sum it up? What is cyclic existence? It's not out there, is it? We each have our own individual cyclic existence to overcome. That really brings it home, doesn't it? Yeah, well, I'm not sure it's a hard and fast definition, but it's a description. The 5, what did you say, the 5 contaminated aggregates? Subject to clinging. Yeah, that's a nice, succinct way of talking about cyclic existence. It's our own aggregates controlled by karma and afflictions, the appropriated, contaminated appropriated aggregates. It's our own mind and body. That's confronting. Yeah, it's not outside. So the story, so then to clearly identify cyclic existence, we need to know who or what is it that cycles in cyclic existence. I remember Venerable Jigme gave a very nice BBC at the end of one of our winter retreats on the 5 aggregates. Do you remember that? I thought it was a very, very thoughtful BBC where she went into a lot of detail of her own personal experience, her own discovery of really reflecting deeply. And maybe it was the 4 Establishments retreat where she had gone deeply into looking at each one of the aggregates to really understand, what is this person? What is this I that I assume exists inherently or exists in a certain way? And really taking that apart to understand, how is it that that set of 5 aggregates gets propelled from life to life? So that's something that we also need to put on our list of things to do. The list is long. So one thing that I come back to again and again is this little summary of our story in cyclic existence, how at the very beginning there is ignorance. And, you know, that's the basis of everything that's driving samsara for each one of us. And it's interesting to think about that ignorance, because it's not just the view of the personal self, the personal I, although that's an important one, but Geshe Sopa spelled out when he was talking about attachment or desire that it also includes those 4 distortions that we work with a lot, that are countered by the 4 aspects of true suffering. When you think about, you know, grasping at permanence and grasping at pleasure, things that are in the nature of suffering as pleasure, grasping at foul things as if they are pure, and grasping at things that are selfless as having a self. So that's a type of ignorance that comes along with many of the, or in addition to, or maybe it's even, we could say it's fueling the afflictions. So we have ignorance that gives rise to inappropriate attention. I love it when we have opportunities to really hone in on that and think about inappropriate attention, so that we begin identifying and then catching ourselves. Oh, look what I'm doing. I'm exaggerating. Look how I'm exaggerating the good qualities of this. It can be very helpful to do that, to catch that. So inappropriate attention then fuels the afflictions, right? It's a basis upon which all of the afflictions are built upon. That exaggeration, and then that gives rise to afflictions. Afflictions, as we know, do you sit still and sit quietly and, very contained when there's an affliction in your mind? That leads to actions, right? Either negative actions or contaminated actions, virtuous actions. And that leaves karmic seeds on our mind stream. And then those karmic seeds are what gives rise to the different results, either a rebirth or causally concordant results in terms of habit or experience, and then the environment that we're born into. So this is a nice summary of the 12 links, actually, when you think about it, isn't it? Ignorance is the first link. Formative actions, the second link. Yeah, it's funny. Okay, so yeah, afflictions is not one of the links, but it's implied. Well, there's afflictions or there's contaminated virtue. Contaminated virtue. It's not spelled out as one of the links, but it's there in between ignorance and formative action. Formative action is number 2. Yeah. We're coming. Okay, yeah. So afflictions, ignorance, and then afflictions. Yeah, thank you. So 8 and 9, craving and clinging, and then formative actions, number 2, and then karmic seeds, number 3. Karmic actions, and then results. So birth and everything else. Name and form, 6 sources, contact, feeling, birth. No, cravings and affliction. Which one? Becoming. Yeah. Yeah. 2 and 10. Okay. All right. So that's a good review. Wasn't intending to review the 12 links, but it's there in that little formula. That's our life story right there. So it's important to think about that. And as Geshe Tabke was running us through, we can think about the forward order of that or the reverse order of that in terms of true, purified or contaminated. Yeah. Okay. So that I'll have to go back and review that. All right. So middle-length Lamrim covers true sufferings in about the same detail as the Lamrim Chenmo. There's a lot of detail there. There's a lot of lists to meditate on. And then the same with true origin, kind of quickly reviews the 10 main afflictions. Do you feel like you know the afflictions well? Yeah. We can go into a lot more detail. And we have some really good books here on Lorig. Geshe Rabten has a book. Gelik Rimshe, do you remember the title? Mind and its Functions? I think that's Geshe Rabten. Mind in Tibetan Buddhism, that has a short section. That's more about the 7 types of awareness, but it has a short section on afflictions. So we have some resources. Oh, there's some of those philosophy. Geshe Sopa's commentary of what? Lamrim Chenmo, that has a little more detail. Can you think of others? You're the librarian.
Venerable Children taught a course on mind and mental factors in like the 90s. It's fabulous. And gave
In 1990?
In the 90s?
In the 90s, sometime.
I think. Yeah, Cloud Mountain.
Okay.
And it goes into about how to really apply it. Her instruction is fabulous.
Wonderful. Okay, so that would be on tiptonshodan.org. So that's a good resource. And Venerable Khadro also went through Lorig. Yeah, not that long ago. So both of those would be on. Yes, Precious Garland also has a nice list of 57 mental factors, secondary. I think most of them are secondary mental factors that are subsumed within the main mental factors. So that can also be another good list to think about, to review. We did it. How many years ago was that? I'm Turn on the
No,
microphone.
but we did it during a winter retreat as a community. We each took one, I think, two. Oh, we took two, and then met every week. So one person presented on that, and we looked at the antidotes, and we had discussion around that. It was super helpful.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, meditation on emptiness has a nice section on the 51 mental factors. Yeah. Yeah, well, maybe we can suggest. No, you can't do too much on those. Exactly. Okay. One helpful thing, I think, is to really think about what is an affliction. And the Lamrim gives us a nice definition of that. What is an affliction? Afflicted, that's a strong word, isn't it? Yeah. It's a phenomena that which, when it arises, it disturbs the mind. So that's helpful to think about. And if we had real conviction in that, as soon as an affliction started to arise in our mind, we would cut it, wouldn't we? But I don't think we're convinced yet. I'm not convinced yet that anger is disturbing. Well, anger is easier. I think we're pretty clear that, anger disturbs our mind. But what about attachment? Are you really clear that attachment disturbs your mind? It has to get to a certain level to become obvious. Yeah, and distressful, actually. After you eat too much, right? Or when the suffering becomes really manifest. Yeah, okay. If we actually, are we even clear that anger disturbs our mind? I've had moments, yeah, probably not. I've had moments where I have been more clear about that, where I thought, I can't afford to get angry. Have you gotten to that point? Like, there are moments, it doesn't last, unfortunately, but there are moments where I think, I cannot afford to get angry, because I see how it impacts my mind. It disturbs my mind so much, I can't really concentrate. I become obsessive, can't sleep as well at night. And I can almost feel sometimes when I've had a really strong amount of anger that it sets me back. I can feel that. It's like, yeah, that's scary, but I think it's helpful to have those moments. Yeah, Venerable Sangye.
But it's quieter, less nasty forms, annoyance, irritation, peeved. When I get into, I haven't gotten to full-blown anger, I've got a whole bunch of justification on why those are okay. It's somebody else's behavior, it's somebody else's speech, it's something that's going wrong. So I have a lot more argument with those than when I'm really, really angry. I mean, my mind can tolerate a whole amount of peevedness and
Without saying or doing things, you mean? Or?
well, no, without saying this is not good. I've got more arguments when it's down the lower form of just annoyed, irritated, a little frustrated, a little peeved. But when I get up into enraged, angry, livid.
Fury.
Yeah. I mean, there's a big space between those, but I have quite a good courtroom on the bottom level of anger that I ride them out a lot longer until I just kind of go, you're tired, give it up. It's or go talk to the person that you're upset with. But I've got a whole courtroom that can really justify a lot of that low level stuff.
Did you know that you were so good at syllogisms? Sounds like you're really good at syllogisms of why you can justify it. My anger is justified because that person. Yeah. So what tips you off that anger, especially these subtle ones? I mean, the gross stuff we can catch easily, but what tips you off that there's anger starting to rise? Shane? What do you feel in your body? What do you feel in your mind?
I noticed during the 37 Buddhist practice this morning, I was right behind the door that's open, and I can tolerate cold pretty good, but I was like, does this need to be open? It's cold out. It's cold outside, and I kept having to come back. I could have got real angry about it, but I kept having to kind of fight my mind. Well, it's making someone else happy, you know, and it just over and over again. And finally, I was able to drop it pretty good. But
Hey, good.
yeah, just to be mindful, you know, and notice those
So it sounds like
first
you caught
signs
the
of
thoughts.
irritation. Yeah.
So it was more at the mental level?
Yeah.
Well, actually, you had some suffering at the physical level, and then that triggered the
Yeah,
thought.
yeah, suffering. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What else? How do you know? Yeah.
I think in like a situation like at work, for example, like feeling stressed out is a good indicator of anger. And then instead of being able to focus on the task, I'm more focused on how stressful and challenging the situation is. And it makes everything so much harder. And I think the internal commentary of like how like horrible or hard it is like a good indicator of irritation being in my mind.
Okay. So when you say stress, you're talking, it sounded like you were talking more about that mental commentary, but there's probably a physical component to stress as well.
Yeah, I guess like the physical component of the stress is like a frantic way of doing things and like just like, yeah, I guess frantic is a good way to put it. Like very like sense of urgency in a negative way. Yeah.
Okay, so that can be a sign for you that you need to really take good care, because that could easily lead to anger. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Yeah. What else? Yeah.
When I catch my mind ruminating, saying the story again and again and again, it's like, okay, I'm obsessing over this thing.
Yeah. So mindfulness is so key, isn't it? Yeah. And there are many ways to develop mindfulness, but I for myself, I sometimes wish I could make myself do more mindfulness practice, because it will be so helpful. You know, when the mind's just a little more quiet, you can see those things more clearly. But everything we're doing, we can bring mindfulness to, and that helps also to develop that mindfulness. And also the study that we do brings mindfulness as well. Introspective awareness as well, checking up to see what's my mind doing. Yeah, good point. So I think this is a worthwhile area of investigation, and I just marvel at Venerable Children's how well she knows her mind. Like, I suspect she catches, if she has afflictions, I bet she does, I don't know, but I bet she catches things so quickly, like just when they're starting to, she's so on top of her mind. Okay.
I remember when we were still getting teachings in Ananda, one afternoon or one evening, we were sitting there, and I don't know what she was teaching on, and I don't know what the issue is, but she said something that tipped a person off the edge, stood up, jumped up, made a remark about, some sarcastic remark about it, and then fled the room.
The person, not
That
Venerable.
person, not Venerable.
Okay.
Right? I mean, this person really reacted big time, jumped up and like, you know, had a few words, accusative words, and fled the room. And I watched her sit there. I watched the color come up to her cheek. She just sat there. And then I watched it go back down. And then she said something like, sometimes people hear things that disturb them. Let's carry on. And this to me is like, oh my gosh, this is my example of how someday, whether you can see the color rise or not, to be able to just hold it and watch it go. That's some amazing practice.
Yeah, beautiful anecdote. Thank you. Yeah, I marvel how well she knows her mind. And that comes from investigation. Yeah, her own deep investigation. Not to bring distraction, but I think it's knowing. Rain mixed with snow this morning. Okay. So afflictions are these distinct mental factors that when they arise, they cause our mind to be disturbed, unpeaceful, agitated. And to recognize that and to really have conviction about that is going to help us want to apply an antidote sooner, you know, to catch it faster, put it down sooner. So that's worthwhile area to really focus on. The other thing to keep in mind about afflictions, the reason they disturb is because there is some lack of basis in reality. That's another thing. If I really had conviction of that, I'd want to antidote them sooner. I love that phrase, and Venerable's been saying it a lot more in the last few years too, that the only time we suffer is when we're out of touch with reality. And so I don't recognize enough that each one of these afflictions are out of touch with reality. When we're in touch with reality, positive states of mind, like loving kindness, compassion, ethics, wisdom, well, not ethics, but integrity, consideration for others, those are aligned with reality. And so they can be developed limitlessly. That's their basis. That's why they can be developed that way. But the afflictions have some distortion, some exaggeration, elaboration, something that's not quite right, some incorrect aspect to it that therefore makes it vulnerable. That's the only good news thing. The good news about afflictions is that they're vulnerable because they're not based in reality, and that's what allows them to be undercut. So the only time we suffer is when we argue with reality. I think that's been really helpful for me to think about. Okay, so let's turn our attention to what the book calls desire or attachment, or sometimes it's called desirous attachment, which kind of puts it together, because there's desirous attachment. There's also types of desire that we want to cultivate. I thought this was very interesting. Geshe Sopa made this point in his commentary of the Lamrim. He said that if you think about how attachment operates, it's exaggerating. First of all, it's based on this distorted attention, inappropriate attention, that's exaggerating the good qualities. And then, different than anger, it kind of slowly seeps in, our mind sinks into the object. Our mind becomes so ensnared and blended with the object as if that object has happiness in and of itself. And then it's hard to extract, like oil in a cloth. But he said, actually, we're trying to cultivate this kind of state of mind when we're focusing on good qualities. Isn't that interesting? We want our mind to sink into renunciation. We want our mind to sink in and become familiar with bodhicitta and loving kindness, compassion, bodhicitta, things like that, wisdom. So it's interesting that it just has this one character, or this characteristic of being distorted. And that's then what tips that into being unproductive for us. So I find it helpful to have hard and fast, or definitions. Find one that works for you and really hang on to it. There are so many different translations and different ways of explaining these afflictions, but find one that you like, that you can hang on to. So we could say that attachment is a mental factor that, based on distorted attention, that exaggerates the attractiveness of a polluted or contaminated object and wishes for it and takes a strong interest in it. So there's lots of pieces there. It's a mental factor. It's not a main mind, it's a mental factor. And we know that these afflictions only accompany mental consciousnesses, right? So we see something with we engage with something with one of our senses, and then almost in the split second, faster than the speed of light, there's a mental consciousness accompanying that sense consciousness, and it's often has an affliction with it. If it's pleasant, if we're looking at an object, there's a pleasant feeling, then there's attachment. If there's an unpleasant feeling, then there's anger. So it has that distorted attention. And, when the object appears appealing or attractive in a way that's like integral to the object, like it's inside the object, and if we only had that object, then we would have the happiness. That in itself is crazy when you really think about it. How can you bring happiness into your body? Happiness is a mental feeling. Pleasure is a mental feeling, right? How can we bring that into ourselves from something external? And yet we try. So it has this zingy anticipation. Venerable Jigme likes that word, zingy. Can you relate to that? Oh, if only I get this, I'll be happy. I'll get some pleasure. Or it has this clingy fear of separation. If we have the object, then we're clinging to it. We don't want to be separated. If we don't have the object yet, we're really going after it, seeking it, then there's more of this zingy feeling. And it obscures the faults of the object. Yeah, we shake our heads, and in the moment, I can't see that. I can't see that this thing is a contaminated object. It's a true suffering, whatever it is that's out in front of me. And yeah, I can't see its true faults. So it's a polluted object. It's under the influence of ignorance. So due to these different types of ignorance, then we see things as permanent, or we see things as in the nature of pleasure instead of suffering as they really are, etc. We see them as inherent. Okay. Then we take a strong interest in it. That's when we're doing the gluing. We're adhering to the object, really fusing with it in a way. Our mind sinks into the object and thinks it exists the way it's appearing to us. This is one of the hardest things to really bring home. Just because I think something doesn't mean it's true. I think that object's going to bring me happiness, but yeah, that's just a thought. And then wishes to possess it. We pursue it, we cling to it, we really want it to be there. And the function gives us a clue as to the bad news about attachment, because the function is to produce discontent. And that's one of the main disadvantages of attachment, isn't it? We're often feeling dissatisfied, discontent, whether we get the object or not. Even, actually, I think it's stronger when we get the object and it doesn't fulfill us the way we thought it would. There's disappointment, there's discontent, dissatisfaction, didn't pan out. Do we stop and dwell on that and really take that in? You were talking about how important with the meditation, it's important to dwell on the conclusion we come to. But no, we go off to the next shiny object. So we keep ourselves busy like that. So it functions to produce discontent and to perpetuate cyclic existence. If you think back to the description of true origin in the 16 aspects, it's, is it craving and karma. So there you have it. It's a form of attachment. Craving is right there as the cause of our cyclic existence. So the challenge is that we think attachment is the means to our happiness and satisfaction. And so here we are in the middle scope, but we need to go back to the initial scope, right? And shore up our understanding of those 4 general characteristics of karma. Where does happiness come? Karma is definite, right? Karma is definite. Again, if we had more conviction in that, then when these shiny objects come in front of our senses, we wouldn't grasp after them. We'd remember the cause of my happiness is my own internal positive state and the positive actions that I'm doing. That can be a great antidote if we familiarize with it. Yeah. Yeah, karma is definite. Just reminding ourselves, where does happiness come from? Okay. So there are countless things that we can be attached to. So what are some of the main things you find you're attached to? Food? How many? Tea? Sleep? Tea? You as well? Pizza? Pizza, good pizza. Cheesy pizza. What's that? Good health. Yeah, we can be attached to our good health. Pleasant feelings. Glad you mentioned it, because that's really what's underlying a lot of our attachment. What? That's the main thing. Yeah, as soon as there is going back to birth is suffering because it's the origin of the afflictions. As soon as there is contact and there's a pleasant feeling, often there's attachment right away. And the opposite with anger. Yeah, we're attached to pleasant feelings. If we look underneath, why am I wanting those crunchy, salty things on the snack shelf? It's because I'm wanting that pleasant feeling either on my tongue or in my stomach, one or the other. So that's really important to highlight and pay attention to. Yeah. What else?
I was thinking about how all my, my perceptions and my thoughts, I try and make permanent, see the inherent pleasure or pain or whatever, like if I'm having a hard time, at my job, I just wrote this down because I see myself as permanent. I also view my perceptions and problems as permanent. Then I say to myself, poor me, I am overworked, etc. I don't have a flexible mind that sees through these afflictions, that acknowledges that I have options. I can tell myself that, yes, this is difficult right now, but it isn't permanent. It has an end.
Yeah. Well, and you've hit on one of the main antidotes to attachment is seeing that whether it's an internal thing that we're attached to or it's an external thing, like internal like pleasure or external thing like a job or being overworked. Where was I going with that? Oh yeah, one of the main antidotes is to see its impermanence. Because the mind has this tendency to apply this ignorance of grasping at permanence, like this is going to last forever. It's one of the big lies we tell ourselves. Oh no, it's going to last forever. Or, yeah. So thank you. There are countless things. Nobody said their looks. That's probably a good thing in a group of monastics. 8 worldly concerns. Reputation, praise. Yeah, that's where we. Oh, that's where I get hooked. Yeah. Okay. Lots of things. Ideas, opinions, situations, circumstances. Yeah. Being right. Thank you for being honest. Being right. Yeah. And of course, one of our deepest attachments is to ourself. In Geshe Losang Gyatso's book on bodhicitta, he talks about, and there are different ways to talk about self-centeredness, but he talks about it as if it's an attachment to the self. Like first there's self-grasping, and then there's attachment to the self that is attached to our own self-interest at the expense of others. So when the two come together, I think you can describe it as an affliction because they come together. It's afflicted by ignorance. It's not really an attachment, but not the way Venerable talks about it. But yeah, we're attached to ourself and all the aspects, all the attributes of the self. I think it's also helpful to think about when we're attached to something, whether it's a person or a thing, a physical thing or an idea, a new pair of something, whatever it might be, that comes from Amazon. We're not actually attached to that thing. Like, here's the thing. We're not attached to that thing. We're attached to our idea or the misconception of that thing, Yeah. So that can be helpful to try to keep that in mind, that it doesn't exist the way it appears on all those different levels. So, antidotes. Some of you were here for the Getting Honest with Attachment retreat. We filled a whiteboard full of disadvantages of the disadvantages of attachment. Have you thought about that? Venerable Chodron is the one who introduced me to this idea of making these lists. And for a long time, I had these lists that I would look through. She encouraged us to make these lists of disadvantages of all the afflictions. How does it affect you physically? What happens physically when you're attached to something or someone? What happens mentally, emotionally? What happens in your relationships? What happens spiritually when you have attachment going on? And for the longest time, I had these very used, worn, dog-eared pages that I kept because I kept adding to them as I found new antidotes. And darn, I looked for them today, and somehow in one of my movings, I've recycled them or something. So it's time to make a new list, I think, just to keep that very fresh. I find that one of the most powerful antidotes. When I first started working with anger, that was one that really smacked me in the face, to think about those disadvantages of anger every day, keep it in forefront in my mind, and it really started to help make a difference. So as Shane mentioned, really one of the main antidotes we're encouraged to cultivate is to think about impermanence. That counters the grasping at permanence. So think about the impermanence of the object, that it's not going to last. It's not going to be there forever. It's changing moment to moment. Whether that's a thing or a relationship, this is really hard to apply to relationships. We don't enter into relationships thinking, oh, this will end one day, it's impermanent. But that's the reality of it. All things that come together part at some point. That's just one of the general characteristics of the aggregates as well as all contaminated phenomena. What else? What are some of the disadvantages that you think of, that you call to mind, that help you to stay on top of attachment, other than the ones you've mentioned? Venerable's given us a list. Yeah.
It's exhausting.
It's exhausting.
Because I have to continually enhance. Continual enhancement of what it is that I'm attached to make sure that it somehow sustains, is permanent, the pleasure that I'm receiving. So after a while, it's like, the mind's glassed over, the thing is lost, it's lost its interest. So one of the disadvantages is how physically and emotionally and mentally exhausting it is to sustain the pleasant feeling from that object.
That is a really good thing to identify and come to. Have some of you, others of you had that same experience? Good, yeah. It's helpful, isn't it? All right, so realizing that it's exhausting to be involved with attachment. Yeah. What else?
Waste a lot of time that could be spent on better things.
You sure waste a lot of time. Yep. I remember there was a period of time where I was quite involved with Facebook, and I was attached. And I could see I would just like this scrolling addiction, like, oh, just one more, just one more. This was years ago. But one day it finally dawned on me, if I had been meditating on compassion for every moment I'd been on Facebook, I'd be enlightened by now. And I just went cold turkey and stopped using it. So yeah, it wastes a lot of time. Yeah.
Never as good as I think it's going to be.
It's never as good as you think it's going to be. Really? Yeah, so that dissatisfaction is right there. Even if we get what we want, it's never as good as because there's a discrepancy between the actual object or person or situation and our superimposed exaggeration of what it's supposed to be. Yeah. Yep.
Negative actions that I do and the negative speech that I engage in to assure and to continually have that relationship with that object. So I do all sorts, strategizing, manipulating, lying, enhancing things, concealing things. A lot of things when I want what I want when I want it.
Yeah, so it leads to a lot of different unethical behavior. And it sounds like you fleshed that out in terms of some of the afflictions that come along with that. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Because we're simply never satisfied. It's very expensive.
Yes. Yeah. I had a friend who bought a house, and as soon as they bought a house, that was very expensive. And then, they started looking around the house and thinking, I've got to fix this, and I've got to fix that, and then I've got to redecorate and add this in the backyard. It needs a new fence. Yeah. Yeah. We're not homeowners here, but we can understand that. What else? Yeah, Shane. Oh, Venerable Pug?
It's distraction. You can't concentrate properly because you're
Yeah.
constantly thinking about it.
That's so good to identify because we need concentration. And when you're not able to concentrate, that is a suffering. Yeah.
I think for me, the main antidote has to be the suffering I would cause other people if my afflictions are going crazy. So kind of trumped everything for me. So.
So what comes to my mind is that if I'm attached to someone else, I'm also including them in some non-virtue, and getting them to, have this fantasy of there's going to be happiness if we go to the movies or, do whatever we do together.
Yeah, or if I get irritated, how, if I don't deal with that quick, I'm going to say something, be negative, say something, harsh speech, whatever.
Attachment often leads to other afflictions, that's for sure. We get angry when our attachment doesn't get what it wants. Also, to take that even to a bigger step is to think about when we're involved in attachment, we are harming the sentient beings that we have espoused to be wanting to help, because we're wasting time. We're not fulfilling our bodhicitta aspiration. So that can be, sometimes that can be an antidote that gets us back on track. Yeah, it's alarming how much time we can waste. Yeah. Tenzin.
Sometimes I feel that attachment is like holding a pail of water and then holding it, and then after I take it, I need to let go, and then I take out another thing again. You know, it's like holding in this position. And then you will get tired, you get bored, you know, you get like angry about it, and then you want to let go, and then you start to grab another thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good characteristic. Uh-huh.
I think a disadvantage of attachment is placing like unfulfillable expectations on others that end up
Yeah.
really harming them.
That's another way we harm. Yeah, we have unrealistic expectations of other people because of this exaggeration that we put on them, and then they're not living up to our projected fantasy of who they are.
How could they? It's not real.
Right. It's not, yeah, it's not the object, it's something we've imputed on it. Good point. Okay, so we've just barely gone into one affliction. So luckily, Venerable Khadro was doing a weekend on anger. Do you know the dates? 25 through 27. So we can review that affliction at that time. And in the meantime, it's good to spend time looking at pride and all those 7 types of pride. I always found that so humbling to think about, because I've experienced all of them. Doubt, I'm not aware that I've had a lot of doubt. How about you? Yeah? Okay, some of you have more doubt than others. But again, really taking time to think about the definition, think about the disadvantages of having that, how it affects you physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And then ignorance, the mental factor of ignorance. And especially Venerable Khadro was saying that we're talking about the mental factor of ignorance, that is ignorant or unknowing about certain things like the Four Noble Truths, the 3 jewels, karma. Yeah. Okay, so we can take a lot of time and really flesh these out. We need to, actually, because the more we do that, then we'll catch them sooner, we'll put them down faster. All right, so let's rejoice that we had a little bit of time this morning to review where we are in the Lamrim, and also taking some time to look at attachment, and in whatever way, just see what conclusions you want to come to from our conversation this morning. What is it you want to take away from today and put into action? And then we'll dedicate.
May the spiritual teachers who lead me on the sacred path, and all spiritual friends who practice it, have long life. May I pacify completely all outer and inner hindrances. Grant such inspiration, I pray. May the lives of the venerable spiritual mentors be stable, and their virtuous actions spread in the 10 directions. May the light of wholesome's teachings dispelling the darkness of the beings in the 3 worlds always increase. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their sufferings. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore.
Thanks, everyone.